Flynn, thank you so much for actually wait. I just want to say, I think it is such a testament to crypto how this conversation came about, which I wonder if we can just talk about that for a second, which is that yesterday I jumped into the Rabbithole Discord because I was I was troubleshooting a Bright ID issue that I was having, and then you jumped in and replied to me. We started DMing, and less than a day later, we're having a conversation. So you are kind of everywhere in the space, and you are such a perfect example of this idea that people in crypto are very multifaceted. I wonder if we could start with maybe just your vision for Rabbithole, especially now that you have just received funding, and what that kind of looks for you over even just the very immediate future.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Brian, and I work on this project called Rabbithole. And really how Rabbithole came about, and I can talk about the vision for a second, is I noticed that a lot of protocols are launching in the space. This was even a year ago when there were only 15 protocols that exist. And normal users only knew about crypto from a speculation standpoint. They thought it was just currencies, and didn't actually realize that applications existed. And I started to notice that we were basically on this trajectory of more protocols are starting to launch in the space, with multiple protocols launching, each week. And the normal average user doesn't actually care about the underlying application or protocol. They just care about the token itself, which is as a means to make money and to gamble. And so none of them actually go deep enough to understand in some cases, right? And the most important thing to me was actually the education aspect of it, was actually understanding the protocol and using the protocol, touching and feeling it, as opposed to like the speculation standpoint, right? When you kind of talk to someone outside of crypto and ask them, you work in crypto, their response to you half the time is, "Oh, I know Bitcoin, or I know Dogecoin, or I know SafeMoon," and that's not ideal, right? But we should really be talking about things like ownership and governance, and why it matters in some cases, right? And that is like one of the biggest leaps, like an entire space for someone to make. And so Rabbithole from the offset is sort of leaning into the whole speculation aspect as a means of getting people in the door, but actually empowering them to become owners in these protocols in the long term by building this on-chain resume of some sorts, right? Because what happens in crypto is, as you start to make transactions, sure, you're proving your worth to protocols and tokens, but you're starting to build this on-chain resume of some sorts. And so like our premise with Rabbithole, especially kind of with the rat, is sort of becoming this on-chain resume, where the more transactions that you do on chain, the more that you're sort of proving yourself out, the more credentials that you're starting to build, which actually starts to give you some more opportunities in the future, whether it's for a job or whether it's for token distribution. Those things will make you unique in some certain standpoint, and give you access to specific communities in the future. There's this kind of other element to it, more on the social token side. So like in Web 2 right now, we're kind of reliant on social graphs, right? Based off who we follow and who follows us, information and communities are surfaced to us. What happens in Web3 is that our participation graph and the tokens that we own is sort of this new interest graph, right? Where we can basically be recommended new communities and tokens based off what we own and what we've done provably in some aspect across multiple applications, that's sort of on chain in some capacity and not just contained into one platform. So Web3 basically becomes a new way to recommend communities or tokens based off what someone has done in the past across any interface. And so the combination of those two things is really where Rabbithole is trying to go, right? Where this basically, as you build these credentials, you're being suggested these new types of communities and opportunities based off your skill set and things you've done in the past and what might interest you. That's not determined by a single algorithm, but more of a provable on-chain data component. And that's all it goes to say that what's really important to us is just getting more people into crypto and participating as an owner and in governance, right? And the more people that we can have in the room making decisions, ultimately, the more that these protocols are going to advance in kind of the long term. So basically, building tools to just empower people to make decisions into each of these protocols that they're using, as opposed to just being a speculator.
Okay, so I really appreciate that term, like empowerment and empowering people, because Rabbithole was actually one of my kind of first experiences, like hands-on experiences in the crypto space. So I completed the ENS quest, I think, and it was so empowering. I think that is the best description of how I felt when I went through that process. Also, what I really appreciated about Rabbithole was it was the first time that I experienced the magic of crypto, which was literally for me, it was connecting my wallet, and I honestly freaked out. It was connecting my wallet and then seeing Rabbithole track me onto ENS and then linking that activity back to my Rabbithole profile. And that moment just blew my mind, and I got so excited. And I'm I guess very passionate about education in general, and so I kind of started thinking forward into all of these scenarios where on-chain identities and education mesh together in the metaverse and how that plays out. But yeah, so this idea of taking participants who maybe don't know where to start and are not kind of even sure, I feel like for a lot of people who are speculators, you might go to CoinMarketCap every day, and based on the token price or the market cap, you kind of make decisions based on those numbers, where to put your money. But you might never, it's really easy to be on a trading platform and buy a token and literally never go to the that protocol's page or interact with it. And so I really appreciate also the curation aspect as to feeling really lost and not knowing where to start. So do you think in terms of, I know that crypto, the intention is to take over the world, but just with the people already in the space at the moment, that market that are speculators, is that who you're targeting in terms of participation, or is it an entirely kind of different group of people?
Yeah, so a lot of the people who are sort of like participating right now in governance is sort of like 1% of the actual like crypto users themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people who actually care the most are not necessarily in crypto, right? So the product is very much dependent on sort of like these power users right now. Like it's definitely not beginner necessarily, but our end goal is to basically be an entire 0 to 1 onboarding experience to any protocol, right? Everything from connecting a wallet to getting your first ENS to getting your first avatar to making your first transaction to learning about how networks work. Everything along those lines of actually getting people in is sort of where we need to go, because the people who are going to participate the most is sort of like the mainstream crowd.
Mm-hmm.
And what's going to happen in crypto is that it's sort of going to be split off into two separate streams, right? It's sort of going to be like the fintech companies right now are basically going to integrate DeFi in the back end, right? Probably in the next 6 months to a year. Companies like PayPal and all these others basically just getting hundreds of millions of users. They're going to drive the rates of yield farms like completely down in some cases, right? And PayPal's can probably take most of those assets. And what that really leaves open is sort of this like long tail crypto networks that are not deeply integrated into the front ends of these fintech companies.
Mm-hmm.
And those are actually probably where the most innovation is actually happening. But the question becomes is like, how did those protocols get those users? And that is kind of where like Rabbithole comes in some cases, right? We're basically funneling attention into the long tail of these crypto networks for people who want to find sort of these asynchronous job opportunities, not like full-time employment in some cases, right? And so in some cases, what's happening right now in crypto and sort of at a high level is that Instead of people working full-time jobs, they were sort of working asynchronously across different DAOs and protocols. And some of those things are, pretty standard, like creating NFTs or being a marketing person. But there's also like some job opportunities that are like much more on chain in some capacity, right? Things like running a node, for example, or creating yarn strategies, or curating, right? All those tasks that are necessarily on chain that are somewhat skillful in some capacity, right? And not many people know how to do those tasks right now. And the people who know how to do those tasks are just found through Twitter. They've just built up their social capital and they're able to find Twitter. And so what we really need to do is start widening that funnel of the amount of talent available that can do those tasks, and then funneling them into those different opportunities. And so that's why we've kind of started very simply, things like making swaps or staking or voting. But really the end goal is to do much more advanced things, where we're sort of upskilling and empowering the user to do like much more hardcore task and having much larger payouts of, say, not just $50, but more like $50,000 or $100,000. And then introducing more crypto native mechanisms over time to actually keep the user more engaged and participating for long times, like on-chain money streaming investing.
Wow.
So all those things kind of wrapped together is just forming a new type of relationship between the protocols and the users themselves, where they can actually tap into new forms of talent.
Yeah. And so do you kind of imagine, just as you're talking, I'm imagining kind of Rabbithole as a gateway to the metaverse that people kind of walk through, that then kind of funnels people into different protocols based on what they're interested in, what their skills might be, and almost Rabbithole kind of in the same way that universities, I guess, are currently used to credential students and then funnel them into workplaces. Is that kind of a way to think about what Rabbithole maybe is?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. That's how I've been describing it to people. It's sort of this university of the metaverse of some sorts, right? It's like if you want to step into this digital world and you don't know where to start, Rabbithole is sort of your guide to figuring out what you should do next in a lot of these cases, right? And this is kind of where the name Rabbithole comes from, because as you start to go down the rabbit hole, you kind of branch off into different rabbit holes. And it's where should you go next based off things that you've already done in a lot of these cases, right? And what's really important is that, like in a university, the university itself sort of makes decisions of like the worthiness of credential and what people should learn. What's cool about Rabbithole is that eventually it will be decentralized. And what's important is that the users going down the rabbit hole are sort of shifting what that syllabus and what that credential should be for other people coming down afterwards, right? Because they're the ones going to be turning into, people participating in protocols and the owners and the governors, right? And they're going to know what's best for the new people coming in. And what's really important is that we're constantly updating and educating for the new people coming into the system, because things get outdated really fast in crypto. Yeah. And it's also not up to our best interest to be sort of a maximizing revenue in much of cases. Otherwise, if say Tron or Justin Sun comes to us, offers us $10 million to do the quest, it shouldn't be up to us to say yes or no to that, right? It should be kind of in the best interest of users to kind of deliver in a full premise of education and becoming an owner in some network. So that all goes to say, like, yes, this is definitely going to be like a universe in the metaverse, a 0 to 1 type shop, but also fully decentralized in that manner.
Yeah. So I love that it's kind of like a university, but then also the exact opposite in the sense that it is really adaptive and it's decentralized, and it is kind of everything that is wrong, I think, with the current kind of tertiary education experience can be corrected. And also because the kind of space, like you said, demands that of what will be like the new institutions in the space. So yeah, that's really interesting. And I wonder if we could just kind of skip back to just like on the mention of, Justin Sun and Tron, skip back to this idea of education versus speculation. And I feel kind of like thinking about, I guess, broadly about society and why education is important in this kind of real world that we live in. There's this idea that you get an education and maybe like a high school education, you can go to a good university and then you get your signal, which is a degree, which then gets you a job, which pays you money, and then you make lots of money. And that's the point of education. And now with crypto, with speculation, like you said, dog coins, and everything else, you can go straight to that kind of endpoint without having to go through any sort of education, which is kind of interesting. So if you say to someone, you could go through these quests that we have for Aave, or you could have just bought Aave 6 to 12 months ago, and will they still be interested in the education? I guess like tuning into those intrinsic and extrinsic motivators about if you take the money out of it, what is the value of education? Like why? And I think this might lead into this idea of kind of governance and participation. But for you, when you kind of remove that aspect of the money, is it possible for education to stand alone?
Yes, and the reason is the same aspect of in Web 2, right? Mm-hmm. In Web 2, when you're tweeting, for example, you're not making any money, but what you're doing is building your social capital. Mm-hmm. And the same premise kind of happens in Web 3 in some aspects, is that when you're transacting and when you're proving your learning without having a token component to it, you're sort of building your on-chain resume in that aspect. You're building your transaction history out, identifying you as a type of user who has qualified yourself to some aspect, right? Because it's much more about meritocracy than anything else. Mm-hmm. So in the same way that people will basically build their social capital in Web 2 is the same reason people build their transaction history in Web 3, because it gives them some unique opportunities in the future to qualify themselves for whether it's a recruiting opportunity or token distribution or investing. All of those will be beneficial to a user for those opportunities.
Yeah. And could you maybe just run through this idea of skills and quests on Rabbithole?
Yeah, for sure. So in Rabbithole, everything is on chain, right? So it's all about taking whatever action is on chain, can be anything from swapping, lending, staking, voting, sort of you name it, and then tracking that to see if the user has accomplished it. It's sort of like a proof of learned of some cases. So a skill is basically sort of what it sounds like. It's sort of like a certificate, sort of like qualifying the user for like some future opportunity. And a quest is basically a way to earn tokens. So you need a skill to do a quest. There's going to be hundreds of skills on Rabbithole and much fewer quests. Skills are something that is evergreen, so anyone can complete it. And quests are ephemeral, so there are a limited amount of rewards that exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Just this idea of quests, I wonder if it's a way to think almost about advertising in a Web3 way, which is that traditionally maybe companies would throw money at marketing channels to try to acquire users, but it would be in return for attention, which, a user is just left with nothing really. Like you lose the time and you kind of don't have anything to show for it. Whereas with a quest, it's kind of still that it's a way of acquiring a customer that then leaves, or not a customer, a participant that leaves that participant with, like you said, that kind of proof of learning or proof of engagement, which is really interesting.
Yeah, no, this was exactly sort of why we built the first version of Rabbithole, because you noticed there wasn't this crypto native advertising channel, right? Most protocols and teams, if they want to acquire users, they'll either put their money towards a hackathon, put their money towards a newsletter sponsorship. Facebook, banned crypto ads. YouTube banned crypto ads. Twitter banned crypto ads, right? Especially last year. So it was really hard for them to find like crypto native advertising channels, right? And so what most protocol and teams did was they would just be really, really loud on Twitter and trying to meme their way to get users, frankly, right? And so what ended up happening is through that method of advertising awareness, um, they were basically just started shilling the token, frankly, as opposed to engaging people into the product.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw that as sort of like the biggest problem, right? And now we can actually measure an acquisition cost of a user, right? By saying, maybe it's like $6 of a token to get user to kind of using the protocol, right? You weren't able to measure that sort of acquisition before Rabbithole. So it's a much more interesting way to kind of like bring users into the system. What you can also do is like through this skill and credentialing system, you can basically start filtering types of users that you want in your protocol,
Mm-hmm.
right? So maybe you're like an NFT lending protocol, right? Well, you can actually require skills in a quest for distributing your token through some like NFT minting credential and some like lending credential, which are both like core features of your protocol. So like that type of user is the one actually engaging in your product and earning tokens that has potentially a high LTV of engaging your protocol in the long run and becoming a major participant. So that's definitely, so we see this as sort of like a crypto native advertising channel almost. It's kind of, I'm not the biggest fan of using that term just because it's, advertising is sort of like, yucky to a lot of crypto people, but it kind of is like very much filtering and targeting for the right types of people that you want as part of your network and token holders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting in terms of the language that we'll have to come up with a different term because advertising is so, there is such a strong definition associated, especially with kind of Web 2 tech companies. But in saying that, I'm also really glad to kind of just make this connection in my mind because that was a really big hurdle for me in terms of even just, I guess, the business models and how the users benefit. So, I understand that trading your attention and your time giving that to a platform with that the platform makes money from advertisers and the user is left with nothing is bad, but I just couldn't wrap my head around what the alternative looks like. And so that's I'm really glad that we were able to cover that because I think that really unlocks a lot for me in terms of really how Web3 enables that value to flow all the way kind of from the protocol to the user, through any other stops that it might make as well. But I think that is a huge shift that really needs to happen. I'm excited to see that play out everywhere. And so maybe I wonder if we could just talk about this idea of skills being evergreen, which I really like, and kind of building up an online resume. So what, in your opinion, is kind of wrong with this kind of CV and then recruitment relationship that we have at the moment, and how do you think that will change in the metaverse?
Yeah, so right now with resumes, you're sort of trusting the interviewee or the person applying for the job of like, does this actually measure their reputation in some cases, right? Are they actually capable of doing this work? And you're usually using the CV as sort of a filter in a lot of cases, right? You still need to do an interview process. You still need to get, reference checks. You need to see what type of person they are to see how truthful and kind of how it matches the CV in some cases, right? What has happened over the last, say, 5 or 10 years is that social capital has become a replacement for the CV in a lot of cases, right? A lot of the reasons why people use Twitter, frankly, is to sort of build up their social capital CV, right? And so a lot of people use Twitter for recruiting, for example, including us. But it's still not the best way of doing it in some cases because it becomes all about signaling and attention as opposed to anything else. And what's interesting about an on-chain resume is that any digital work that you do as things become more on chain is provable, right? So it's no longer sort of like creating your resume from scratch and typing it up on a Google Doc or Microsoft Word, a bit more actually just signing a message proving that you've done everything in the last 3 to 4 years, right? With of course some privacy elements baked in with something like ZK rollups or whatever. Therefore, it becomes a much more efficient way of seeing if a user is telling the truth, and it reduces a lot of complexities, right? Now users can basically apply for job positions and token distributions, right? I kind of see those as simultaneous cases, based off that on-chain resume, right? And so going to your point before, like skills being evergreen is sort of saying, what are the skills that are going to be interchangeable almost into every DAO? What is a role every DAO going to have? And then it is up to us and sort of the community to decide these are the skills that should be displayed in Rabbithole, right? Like asset manager is one of our skills, for example, and treasury management is becoming a much bigger skill in a lot of DAOs right now. So we can actually train managers through having this skill and then saying to all these protocols, all these DAOs, like, hey, we have 600 asset manager, treasury managers who have completed that skill. You should offer an opportunity to give ownership or employment to these 600 people who complete this skill, right? That is kind of how we see our skills playing out in the future as sort of a way to start qualifying users based off what the protocol needs, and getting them to engage in the protocol.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. I know that recruitment is such a kind of pain point, whether you are a FANG company or whether you're a local cafe, it doesn't matter, because when it comes to recruitment, like it's a really difficult problem to solve. And I think that idea that kind of going from the top of the funnel to the bottom of the funnel, in terms of people who are best qualified, who are likely to be most engaged, who are kind of still have kind of stuck it out in that sense, as opposed to just making it not a free for all, but there are essentially kind of no hurdles versus you can see someone's been participating for the last year and a half. They've completed all these tasks. I can imagine as a recruiter that would make your kind of life a lot easier. And I think also just this idea in crypto of coordination being such a potential feature of Web3 and the ability to coordinate humans, it seems, and kind of that value that humans bring to the space, I think might be one of the kind of biggest, if it's possible to unlock that, then you can't help but be really optimistic about the future, because it feels like at the moment, even just this idea of the skills being almost kind of created in collaboration with whether it's like a DAO or a protocol and being useful is actually kind of novel for me. I know in my degree, I got to an internship and I realized that I'd spent 4.5 years not learning a single thing that was actually useful on the job. So this idea that it's really collaborative and then you're coordinating on a level, I don't know, it almost just seems like you care. And that's to say that I guess for me, my experience with universities is that I don't think that they care about that coordination. So what do you think is kind of intrinsic about it for you? This idea that like, what is the potential of coordinating humans in crypto and in Web3?
Yeah, that's kind of a loaded question, but I'll try my best. What's really interesting is that right now it's hard to provide a lot of mass movement to a specific positive sum outcome, right? Most things that drive attention right now in the world in general are sort of like zero sum outcomes almost. Things that are just trying to get people's attention right away in a lot of cases, right? I'd say in the past year alone, most products build for attention rather than product market fit, and sort of purposefully because they know that they can then sell a product afterwards once they have the attention. Right. And so what's really interesting about Web3 is that it takes away from the attention and social graph, which is sort of plaguing people almost. It kind of has this chokehold. And it moves to this participation graph that I was mentioned before, which is now actually finding the people who are actually using and contributing and rewarding those people with potential opportunities, right? It should really be about how do we engage human potential, versus then just suck away someone's attention. Um, there's just so much of kind of the human population that's just sort of kind of at a standby right now, and they don't know what to do, right? And it's really about how can we just get their attention to start doing something. That's really what Rabbithole is to some aspect, right? It's about saying, hey, there's this opportunity that has a very short time frame. You can get paid for it. It has all this tremendous upside, but you have to do it right now because this is going to lead to better outcome, right? And so it's purposely defined to funnel their attention into this actual task to get them to engage in a lot of cases, right? What does this look like in sort of like a much wider scale, like a 10, 100x, right? Well, it's sort of like, 500,000 to a million people doing a single task in sort of like a 1 or 2 day time frame, right? Then you're sort of like activating human talent to then do this thing in a large scale coordination game, right? That has potentially a very positive sum outcome. And that can be like really important into things down the line when you need to engage a large group of people to sort of solve something that may be important for not just the metaverse but for the physical world as well. And so that's why I see sort of the largest opportunities with sort of Web3 coordination.
Yeah, I really like this idea of taking the attention that we already give to platforms and funneling it into something that is more positive sum than zero sum. And just this idea of doing that with a quest, and I guess this idea of extrinsic motivators with rewards, whether it's as tokens and or kind of crypto. How do you kind of think about gamification as it plays out and this idea of extrinsic rewards and I guess the potential for gamification to be gamed?
When you say gamification to be gamed, do you mean in terms of like Sybil resistance?
Yeah, I guess Sybil resistance, and then also maybe not these power users, but I guess people who are just more advanced. I guess will be looking at Rabbithole, daily, and they see a quest come out. It's very straightforward for them to just like jump on, complete the quest, and they're done. And before you know it, all of the rewards are redeemed. Versus kind of those people who are still sitting on the sidelines, and they're kind of, I almost imagine it like dipping your toe in like a kiddie pool, and now there are people who can swim, like they could just be out in the ocean swimming, but they're like they're still kind of going after those rewards because it is an extrinsic motivator, whereas those in terms of onboarding those other people, how do they compete with that?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, something I think a lot about from a product strategy standpoint. So the answer is that it's complicated. So it's really important that you use like intrinsic motivators to get the user in the door. Mainly because you just need their attention to kind of be activated in the first place. But really the types of users that you want, especially for people who are participating, becoming owners, are people who are intrinsically motivated, right? Because they're the ones who are going to inspire change, so they're in it for the right reasons, not the extrinsic motivators, right? And so the more you add gamification to your product, the more intrinsic motivator type users that are going to exist, obviously. And so there is a delicate balance between the two. You don't want too much gamification. Otherwise, you're going to have the users in it for the wrong reasons, right? There are definitely a bunch of products in the space that overuse gamification. And what happens is they're expecting things like airdrops. And it leads to very much lower quality users in a lot of cases. And so it's really about having that balance, right? We could theoretically have made Rabbithole into, say, like a Pokemon game, right? And have people, quest around and basically blend all the smart contracts into the UI, right? And it would feel like an actual game in itself, but it would sort of lose out on the whole empowerment angle, right? And actually having users participate, right? Because it would make it much more unknown to the user that they're engaging in this sort of the smart contracts, right? In this other larger protocol ecosystem. We really want to keep it simplistic for that very reason, right? The more gamification you add to your product, the more complexity you're also introducing, the higher the learning curve it is. It also makes it hard from like a governance decentralization standpoint, right? Because then you're sort of leaving the gamification up to the community to decide, well, what level of gamification should there be? And it's hard to actually, create that algorithm in sort of like a decentralized way. So those are the reasons why like gamification is sort of bad for products long term, but somewhat useful when you're like bootstrapping the product to actually get users in the door.
Yeah, that's it is a really interesting balance, because I know personally I am it feels like a really primitive part of my brain that like really responds to, I don't know if it's like because we're programmed in school, with like gold star stickers and things like that. I don't know if it's just a hangover from that time, but really kind of, I do really respond to XP points, like, and I am just doing it for myself, irrespective of, whether the quest is still active or, whoever else is doing the skills. I like to just see for myself that number go up. It's probably why I have a ton of streak apps on my phone. But then I guess this idea that, that intrinsic motivator leads to a participant that is fundamentally like has a different profile than someone who is extrinsically motivated. But I suppose, kind of speaking about the social graph and things like that, that would also become obvious perhaps. Like you might be able to see users who only do quests but never do skills, or vice versa. And I don't know, I'm sure there's many ways that this can play out, but I think this idea of kind of thinking about that data being available of someone's, experiences and transactions online is really interesting. And maybe we could just talk for a minute about what you see the potential as with kind of social graphs and public data.
Yeah, so I had a post on this in Mirror about a couple months ago, but it was sort of talking about the on-chain graph as opposed to the social graph. Like, I think this is one of the biggest innovations that's going to lead to more like a decentralized social network, right? Where it's basically bring your own interface, right? So anyone can basically create an interface on top of the relationship between any two token holders, right? So if you and I have the same, maybe it can be like a puppy token or something. I don't know. And like you and I both hold it, then maybe you and I can talk to each other on a specific interface, right? And that interface can be like 8 different directions, right? And we log into the same wallet, and we basically all of our data. If I chat with you on one interface, maybe that message also pops up on another interface because we have that connection between that token itself, right? And that is sort of the power of having an on-chain social graph, is that the attention is no longer specific to one interface or platform, but it's basically spread out to many platforms. And the combination of all the interfaces becomes sort of the metaverse in itself, right? To me, the metaverse is in sort of just like one 3D virtual space that sort of everyone imagines, but sort of like the combination of many interfaces, many Web3 interfaces together, where sort of the smart contract is sort of the shared backend in a lot of cases. So that's sort of like already happening as it stands right now. The question then becomes, how much of our time do we start spending in Web3? I think the average person in crypto probably spends like 5% of their time in Web3 and 95% in Web2. But I think as more things become on-chain, we're going to end up spending majority of our time in Web3. And the fact where we stop using social networks and use more Web3 style social networks, where sort of we have these on-chain graphs as sort of the main ways we process information. And I would classify Rabbithole in this context of being a Web3 social network, because then you're basically able to allocate attention to people who have done specific things on chain, who have specific tokens. I think there'll be dozens of platforms just like that, where they're basically filtering by token holders and allowing token holders to communicate based off that specific on-chain data.
Yeah, that idea especially of the token holders being able to communicate is something that really excites me, because that is something that I feel is really missing at the moment in kind of tech and in the physical world, which is just, it might be a restaurant that I go to every fortnight, and I have no way really of, I might like their Facebook page or their Instagram page, but I have no way of connecting with the other patrons of that restaurant, or, it might be a book that I order from Amazon, or, there are so many ways in which it's almost like we're in the same spaces, but we aren't actually communicating with each other. So I'm really looking forward to how Web3 unlocks that relationship. Yeah.
Totally.
And I wonder if we could just talk kind of, as we're kind of talking about, that real world physical aspect of it as well, just this idea of Sybil resistance and with identities, maybe could you just walk me through how do you think about Sybil resistance and this idea of kind of like proof of humanity, and then linking that to people having reputation, say, on Rabbithole, and whether that is the same as their reputation kind of everywhere on the web? How are people different as entities in Web3?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So what Sybil resistance really means is like proof of humanity, as you said, guaranteeing that you're unique as a user. And so the premise is that if we can solve Sybil resistance as an industry in a very low friction way, then that unlocks several use cases, such as UBI or more efficient token distributions, or one human, one vote, or quadratic funding. So like all these different use cases are unlocked, right? The issue is that the experiences and solutions for subsistence are still not great. And we use Bright ID right now, which is a really good solution, but still has its own problems, frankly. But they're working on it. It's frankly one of the hardest problems in the entire space to solve, right? And what I'm really excited about is this concept of DIDs, which is basically abstracting keys into an identity layer where you can have multiple keys mapped to one address, and then have verifiable credentials on that DID, including your sub-resistance credential of guaranteeing that you're a unique human. And that way, basically, there will be multiple ways to get verified, and other applications can basically just read that credential when you log in as a user, right? And sort of the power of Web3 login is just one click and you're logged in, right? You don't need to have multiple usernames. You don't need to have multiple passwords. Essentially, just one click login in a lot of cases, right? What I think is going to happen in the next maybe like 6 to 12 months is that logging in with your identity or DID will be more common than logging in with your keys. And what that will basically do is that your reputation will be kind of opt-in in some cases, right? The worst case scenario is that basically if there's if your keys have all your reputation, it can introduce a lot of predatory behavior, including like negative reputation in some cases. There are a lot of Black Mirror episodes that sort of point to this type of future. But DIDs can basically solve some of these problems by basically having it opt into the user so that the user can showcase what credentials they want to have public to other applications and other users. And so that's kind of where I see sub-resistance heading in a lot of cases and how it interacts with identity.
That's funny because I guess this idea of Sybil resistance seems like such a huge challenge in terms of getting users to participate and kind of play along in verifying their humanity and things like that. But then I think about it, I think like just in the last 2 weeks, how many times have I entered my address and my phone number into a platform? When I've signed up for something, it's kind of scary and I don't like to think about it. But this idea that could this play out? So maybe I do my Bright ID verification on Rabbithole, and then with my DID, I'm able to kind of expose that information to other platforms and protocols that I sign up to, so that that means that I've checked that box and I don't need to keep doing it. Like I don't need to keep entering a phone number.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so like it's one of those cases where you do the bright ID verification once, and that lives in your DID, and then other applications can just read that you're already bright ID verified across multiple key pairs as well, as long as those key pairs are mapped to the same identity. So if you do the bright ID verification on, say, Ethereum mainnet, and you map that to your DID, and you have, say, a Solana address also mapped to your DID, the Solana address can read that you're bright ID verified in a lot of cases, so you don't have to do the same verification again.
Yeah, wow. So in terms of this kind of like very interrelated web of applications or platforms or protocols that or functionality that needs to exist in Web3 for Rabbithole to kind of step into 100% of the vision that you have. So this idea of kind of like single sign-ons, I guess wallets and on-chain graphs and things like that. Can you maybe just like lay out the other components of Web3 that I guess this idea of like a rising tide, like when all of these things are kind of moving up in terms of their usability and just their functionality, and maybe even just coming into existence, what are those things that would then feed into the success of Rabbithole?
Yeah, so the biggest thing missing so far, which has just come into fruition, is blockchain scalability, right? So the reason that only DeFi and NFTs exist right now is because Ethereum is somewhat the only blockchain that people use. Of course, there's like Polygon, Solana now, but Ethereum still has majority of the market share, right? And Ethereum can only do a certain number of transactions per second, and DeFi and NFTs are sort of one transaction per day, if that. Somewhat, three transactions a week, right? And what will happen over time is that as blockchains start to scale, you'll see much more niche types of crypto networks exist. So I know everyone in like 2017 talked about like decentralized Uber, for example, right? Or decentralized Instacart. All of these like prime examples. They'll eventually start to come to market, right? And actually show some traction in some cases because they'll be all on chain. They'll be able to scale. How are those protocols going to find their drivers or their gig workers? And potentially Rabbithole is an avenue for that, right? Of being able to allocate talent into those different networks, right? So blockchain scalability is sort of like the one thing that's holding a lot of users back. And even in terms of gas fees, right? There's so many users on Rabbithole, frankly, who are just talking about how gas fees are sort of a huge deterrent to getting users to try different applications. But when gas fees approach zero, then it becomes much more feasible for someone just to try a crypto application, earn a few bucks while learning on the way. So that will unlock a huge opportunity just for Rabbithole to just increase the number of users on the platform because of layer 2 and other blockchains. Between blockchain scalability and identity, being able to do cross blockchain reputation, I think that will unlock a pretty big opportunity for us to increase the number of users on the platform.
Yeah. Well, just this idea of gas fees, being expensive, it kind of made me think of something that I think we forget, even when you are learning by taking action with a quest and paying for gas fees, is this idea that, with university costs tens of thousands of dollars, in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars, right, that you pay an institution to learn, which then may not amount to any kind of further income. You may just be in debt. And this idea that with Rabbithole, not only, with skills, it might be free to learn, but then with quests that you essentially get paid to learn, even if it does cost money, it's in such contrast to, I think, kind of the current education system, which it's so, I wonder if it's quite easy to forget that, because when you're in crypto, there is so much, that kind of speculation and trading narrative is so dominant that there is just like this expectation that everyone is making money everywhere. Whereas in the real world, it's like completely normal at 18 to like sign yourself up to $100,000 of debt to emerge with like no tangible skills, but only a signal. You can kind of get an idea of how I feel about traditional education. But anyways, and so, this is something that I think that it would be valuable to kind of strengthen that idea in people's minds that I almost feel like, so privileged that we don't have to pay, that it is accessible to learn. And I guess just this idea of the flattening of the world and accessibility, how does that change recruitment in particular in terms of having on-chain identities that span the globe?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. What's going to happen, I think, is there's sort of going to be a divergence between locality in the physical world and the digital world, right? And the potential to earn a living will be greatly more in the digital world than the physical world in some cases. And it's starting to like already happen with like things like maybe being a creator or like even in Roblox, for example, right? And in sort of these like virtual worlds that are centralized. And a lot of kids, for example, who are like, 10 or 12 are making hundreds of thousands of dollars just creating these like virtual maps, right? And so starting from a young age, I think a lot of people are going to get their first wallets and start transacting and realize they can start making a living on these networks. And it's going to feel like a video game to them, right? In the same way that like by Fortnite, they're just going to start, transacting these DeFi protocols and basically coordinating with their friends. And then their parents will see, oh, they're making a lot of money just like transacting with crypto. And so it will definitely be sort of like a Gen Z driven, or even probably even later, younger generations basically leading the movement into sort of like this whole digital jobs era, right? And the benefits of university are going to be questioned. Probably a lot over the next decade, to the point where I think only about, say, like 25% of the population will go to university, and mostly for like STEM majors. And then for everything else, we'll probably go towards this sort of this on-chain resume in some capacity. So I'm really interested to see how that plans out, especially it's sort of this idea of like more internationalism where like everyone in the globe is sort of competing for the same wage, and sort of like no matter where you live, you get access to the same opportunities, no matter your background. And so that's what I'm like really excited about, is sort of no matter where you're from or who you are, you have access to the same opportunities. And it starts to democratize access to getting and pushing these crypto networks forward, because it's just about activating human potential and talent.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And I am in constant awe of kind of younger generations and their kind of adaptability to technology. And I like constantly play the fellow kids meme in my head, like almost like weekly when I'm on the internet. I'm just like, I don't get it, but I'm just going to, pretend that I do and just like follow these kids because they do get it and it comes so naturally to them. And yeah, it's funny, just even talking about university, and we have this like age group in our mind. You're like, okay, 18 to, whatever it is, like 28-year-olds. And just this idea of building an on-chain identity at 10, I think is going to, fundamentally change what income looks like, what work looks like, what is a game, what is work. So yeah, I'm really also really excited about that space. And so I wonder if in terms of kind of the future of Rabbithole, and you kind of mentioned and alluded to this, evolving into more of a decentralized platform, I guess potentially like a DAO. How do you think, what do you think of kind of the roles of DAOs for what traditionally would have been a company, but what in Web3 is now a DAO? Like, what does that, I guess, like pathway and mechanism look like to you, and how is that different from the past?
Yeah, so I can talk to you about how Rabbithole is doing it, and how we see other protocols are doing it as well. So we basically have 4 core functions that we do as a company to create a class today, right? So that is creating the queries to actually track the different smart contracts to see if users complete an action. Then we have the content itself, so everything you see on the website. Then we have the proposal, which is actually getting the funds to distribute to users. And then we have the NFT, which is sort of the zero marginal cost reward to actually power users, right? So these are like the four things that we think are important to create class. So we're basically starting to outsource that to the community in a lot of cases, right? Um, and so we call this the Pathfinder program, which is sort of like the V1 of our DAO. And the whole concept is that you can start, doing one of these roles and start contributing to Rabbithole. And eventually we'll just keep incorporating these into our platform, right? And so it's not just not just a fully decentralizing, but sort of this intermediary step of how can we get outside contributors, contributing to the success of the platform. And so it basically stops being us creating a product, but more about how do we create tools to make the jobs of the Pathfinders easier over time. We're going to be the real builders of this product. And it's about empowering Pathfinders to kind of do their job, right? So we've already started bringing on Pathfinders to Rabbithole, and right now what they're doing is they're creating content for each of the tasks and quests on the platform. And so it'll no longer be up to us to create all that content, but now we can work with the best content creators in the space and pay them out bounties in USDC or NFTs for kind of completing tasks, right? And so when this looks like University of the Metaverse, this is sort of, all like the syllabus content that you see will be from, like the most popular content creators in the space or even new content creators, right? And it's basically leveling them up in some cases and giving them the social capital that they need for providing value to this larger platform. So same goes for developers creating subgraphs and NFT artists creating NFTs, or the BD people who are like the management consultants, just bankers who are working with other DAOs. Like, you think these are like the four core components that are going to make Rabbithole successful, that could potentially even be valuable to other DAOs. But it's important that we kind of start creating this talent pipeline, because those are ultimately going to be sort of dependent on the success of Rabbithole.
Yeah. And how do you feel as a founder in terms of kind of your faith in the ability of kind of the community to carry out and kind of continue that vision that you have in your mind and continue to kind of build on that? Is there any I guess kind of just like even emotionally, like how do you think about that?
Yeah, no, this is a really important question, because this is where I think a lot of DAOs and protocols have done it wrong. So like in the past, what protocols have done is that they'll basically distribute their token to a bunch of speculators, frankly. People who are providing liquidity, people who are trading on exchanges, right? And what really leads to is mercenaries, not missionaries, right? And people who are not going to participate in the protocol, right? But it's really important that like building your community is a lot like recruiting, right? You want to find people who share the same vision, who share the same mission, because they're the ones who are actually intrinsically motivated, as you kind of talked about earlier, to carry out the mission of what you're doing, right? And so like for the Pathfinder program, like we have a application process, and it's actually a very strict application process. We only accept about like 1% of applicants, because those are the ones who are, we think, very mission driven or very connected to us. We're going to carry out the right functions, right? And building a decentralized network, and I use this analogy all the time, is sort of like building a rocket ship. In that the job of the core team is basically build the rocket ship, and then the job of the community members is basically be the astronauts, right, to kind of like take that rocket ship into space and then carry out on its mission. So it's like the analogy is sort of like choose your astronauts carefully, because you don't want the rocket ship to crash. And so it's important that I think more DAOs and these decentralized networks are much more careful about who they let into their DAO, because the founding team should be very aligned with its community in a lot of cases.
Yeah, that's a really great analogy. I'm going to use that, think of that all the time. And I'm so excited to kind of participate, honestly, just from a user standpoint in Rabbithole, because it has played such a big role for me personally in literally increasing my participation in platforms and protocols in the space. And it's funny that, I saw just like a recent quest, I think like that Gnosis multi-sig, like sign up, create a multi-sig with like 2 wallets. Just like that quest, it made me start thinking about succession and estate planning, and I just kind of started thinking about like, oh wait, is this something that could be used for this? And it was literally only because I was exposed to that quest on Rabbithole that started kind of ticking over in my mind. And to be honest, like I don't know that I would have ever had the confidence to just go and create a multi-sig for just to play with it. And I'm really grateful that Rabbithole kind of creates that playground to almost have like an excuse to learn. But I don't know, to do it in a way that it kind of gives you a push, but it's also a pull. And I think that's kind of exactly what I need. And I can imagine there are plenty of people in this space who also feel the same. So I am so grateful for what you've created with Rabbithole. And I'm so excited to continue to watch how it progresses. And I'm kind of, it's almost like when I start thinking about like all of the potential of Rabbithole, there's almost like not enough space in my mind's eye to capture like the true potential of what it could be. So thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was awesome.